Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 31. We have been in a study of the images of the book of Revelation, and our journey so far began in Digging Deeper moment number 27. You can find these moments on our website at www.eaglesnest.ch or on Facebook and YouTube. In our study, we've seen that Revelation is a series of 4 visions, which we've likened to the 4 acts of a play. We've also seen that Revelation, like a play, has a plot. The plot of a play is how the story unfolds. It's the way the sequence of events takes place. Revelation's story unfolds like the worship service which took place in Herod's temple in Jerusalem in the 1st century. The worship, however, in Revelation takes place in heaven. We've already looked at the first vision or act, which runs from Revelation chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 3, verse 22, and shown how it mimics the beginning of the worship service that took place in the Temple of Jerusalem almost exactly. For more on that, you can go to Digging Deeper number 28. Whereas the first vision or act records the beginning of the heavenly worship service, the second vision or act records the middle and the end of the heavenly worship service, and this vision runs from Revelation chapter 4, verse 1 to chapter 16, verse 21. But it has 17 scenes or 17 primary images, so it's much more complicated than the first vision. Now, so far we've looked at the first 3 scenes. Scene 1 is found in Revelation chapter 4, where John is taken up into the heavenly Holy of Holies and sees God on His throne. The throne of God was represented by the ark in the Holy of Holies on earth. Scene 2 is found in Revelation chapter 5. John sees the Lamb, or a slain Lamb, take a 7-sealed scroll out of the right hand of the one sitting on the throne in the heavenly Holy of Holies. Scene 3 is found in Revelation chapter 6. John sees Jesus, the Lamb, open the first 6 seals of the 7-sealed scroll. For more on these, you can go to Digging Deeper moments number 29 and 30. Tonight we come to scene number 4, which is Revelation chapter 7. But before we look at the imagery found there in chapter 7, we must first introduce something that we've not previously discussed, something I like to call interruptions. As we've observed, the first 2 visions of Revelation contain a complete heavenly worship service which follows the order of temple worship exactly from the beginning to the middle to the end. But this heavenly worship service is interrupted 3 times in the second vision. And these interruptions add to the confusion that we find in Revelation. These interruptions are given for a purpose. They're given to give the reader important information that's not previously recorded. Now, we've provided an outline of Revelation on our website, and if you've not downloaded it or printed it out, we suggest that you do so. It will make following along in these lessons a lot easier. So, the next thing we want to do is to identify the 3 interruptions. The first is found in Revelation chapter 7, which we're getting ready to read in our study. The second is found in Revelation chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 14. The third interruption is found in Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 15, verse 8. Now, if you remove these 3 interruptions and then read Revelation, an amazing thing happens. The progression of the heavenly worship service becomes apparent. In Act 1, that's Revelation chapter 1, through verse 10 through chapter 3, verse 22, we see that worship begins in the heavenly holy place with Jesus tending the 7 lamps in the heavenly holy place. In Revelation chapter 4 through 6, worship progresses in the heavenly Holy of Holies. In Revelation chapter 4, John is taken up to heaven. He sees God on the throne. In Revelation chapter 5, Jesus takes the 7-sealed scroll from the hand of the one on the throne. In Revelation chapter 6, Jesus the Lamb opens the first 6 seals. Everything's kind of going in order. Now, if we skip over the first interruption found in chapter 7, we see how chapter 6 ends with the opening of the 6th seal, and chapter 8 begins with the opening of the 7th. Let's read it. Revelation chapter 6:12. It says, I looked when He, speaking of the Lamb, opened the 6th seal, and behold. So He has the opening of the 6th seal. And if you skip chapter 7 and begin in chapter 8, verse 1, it says, when He opened the 7th seal. So we see that chapter 6 ends with the 6th seal, and chapter 8 begins with the 7th seal. Now, contained in the 7th seal, which is opened in chapter 8, are the 7 trumpets of Revelation, and so the series of 7 begins again. And that's why it gets a little confusing. So if we continue reading in Revelation chapter 8, verse 6 to chapter 9, verse 21, we see that worship resumes in verse 6 of chapter 8, And the worship of heaven progresses with the blowing of the first 6 of the 7 trumpets. The first trumpet is blown in Revelation 8, verse 7, and the 6th is blown in Revelation 9, verse 13. Let's read it. Chapter 8, verse 7. The first angel sounded. Then we turn to chapter 9, verse 13. It says, then the 6th angel sounded. The blowing of the first 6 trumpets is then interrupted with the second interruption in Revelation chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 14, with a vision of John receiving his prophetic call. Notice how it is just like the interruption of the seals occurring after the 6th one. And then in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, worship resumes again with the blowing of the 7th trumpet. We pick it up in chapter 11, verse 15, that says, then the 7th angel sounded. Notice how the worship of Revelation is unfolding in progressive order. It starts with the opening of the first 6 seals, then there's an interruption. Then the 7th seal is blown, and then there's 7 trumpets inside this 7th seal. And then the first 6 seals, or the first 6 trumpets are blown, which is followed by the second interruption. And then worship resumes in chapter 11, verse 15 through 19, with the blowing of the 7th trumpet. And after which, in chapter 12, through chapter 12 and chapter 13, 14, and 15 are all part of the third interruption. And so, worship resumes in chapter 16, verse 1, with the pouring out of the 7 bowls of wrath. So, the heavenly worship service, which began in the first vision, with Jesus tending the 7 lamps in the heavenly holy place, progresses in chapters 4 through 6 in the heavenly holy of holies, with Jesus being given a 7-sealed scroll, and with Jesus opening the first 6 seals. Worship is then interrupted for the first time in Revelation chapter 7. This is followed by the opening of the 7th seal and the blowing of the first 6 trumpets in Revelation chapter 8, verse 6 to chapter 9, verse 21. After verse 21 of chapter 9, worship is interrupted a second time in Revelation chapter 10 through chapter 11, verse 14. It resumes in Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 19, with the blowing of the 7th trumpet, which is followed by the third interruption in Revelations chapter 12 through 15. Worship then concludes with the pouring out of the 7 bowls of wrath, which marks the end of the worship service. We'll look at that a little bit more next week. Your homework for now is to read Revelation, skipping through these interruptions so that you can get the feel of the flow. Now, we've also amended our playbill, we've added these interruptions so that you can see them and how they unfold. And so you can get them from our website. If you've enjoyed this lesson, please share it with a friend. We'll see you next week.